Portsmouth Naval Command, England, June the 2nd, 1944. Captain Robert H. Leland stood in the rain outside Warehouse 14 with a clipboard growing soft in his hands and a problem that wouldn't solve itself by morning. The warehouse doors hung open to the dark, and inside, under dim electric lamps strung between the rafters, 243 GMC CCKW trucks sat nose to tail in rows that stretched back into shadow. Each truck was loaded with ammunition crates, jerrycans of fuel, medical supplies, rations, and bridging equipment. Each was scheduled to cross the Channel within 72 hours as part of the second wave of Operation Neptune, and each, according to the revised tonnage calculations that had landed on Leland's desk at 2300 hours, was now overloaded by an average of 400 pounds. Are you enjoying the content? Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. He had been a quartermaster for 2 years, a captain for 18 months, and a soldier long enough to know that 400 pounds per truck, multiplied by 243 trucks, multiplied by the number of convoys staged across southern England, was not a clerical error. It was a command decision dressed up as a miscalculation. Somebody above his pay grade had looked at the supply requirements for the Normandy beachhead and decided that the official weight limits for the CCKW, 6,000 pounds of cargo on paper, closer to 7,000 in practice, were guidelines, not laws. Somebody had gambled that the roads in France would hold, that the axles wouldn't snap, that the drivers wouldn't lose control on the muddy coastal tracks, and that the entire logistical architecture of the largest amphibious invasion in history could be built on a lie about carrying capacity. Leland folded the clipboard against his chest and walked into the warehouse. His left knee ached where shrapnel from a roadside mine near Bizerte had torn through the joint 16 months earlier. The limp was slight but permanent, a rhythm that marked him as a man who had been closer to the war than most officers with his job title. He moved between the trucks, running his hand along cold metal fenders slick with condensation, checking tie-downs and tarpaulins by habit. The air smelled of diesel fuel, canvas, gun oil, and the salt wind coming off the harbour. Rain drummed on the corrugated roof. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded twice, low and mournful. A British liaison officer stood near the loading dock, smoking a cigarette under the overhang. Major Thomas Aldridge, Royal Army Service Corps, late 30s, lean and grey-eyed, with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. He had been assigned to coordinate British and American supply operations for the Neptune convoys, which meant he spent most of his time translating between imperial and metric measurements, reconciling incompatible radio frequencies, and trying to prevent two Allied armies from accidentally starving each other. He watched Leland approach with the expression of a man who already knew what the conversation would be about. "You've seen the revised manifests," Leland said. It was not a question. Aldridge nodded. "Came through our side as well. 800 lorries overloaded across the Southampton staging area. Another 600 here. They're calling it an acceptable risk." Acceptable to who? To General Gale's staff, to General Lee's staff, to anyone who's decided that underloading the first wave means overloading the second. Aldridge dropped his cigarette and ground it out with his boot. "The problem, Captain, is that we don't have enough ships. We don't have enough landing craft. We don't have enough time to make a third wave that actually carries what the beachhead will need by the 8th of June. So we're stuffing every available truck until the springs scream and hoping the French roads are harder than they look on the reconnaissance photos." Leland stared out at the rain. Beyond the warehouse, the harbour was a forest of masts and cranes, landing ships tied up in rows, their hulls painted grey and dull green. Barrage balloons floated overhead, tethered and motionless in the wet air. Somewhere out there, beyond the minefields and the patrolled sea lanes, the coast of Normandy waited under German guns. The plan called for 2 artificial harbours, Mulberry A, off Omaha Beach, Mulberry B off Gold Beach at Arromanches, to be towed across the channel in sections and assembled in place, a feat of engineering so ambitious that it seemed even to Leland like something out of a fever dream. But until those harbours were operational, every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every can of rations, every roll of bandages had to come ashore through surf and sand and chaos, carried by amphibious DUKWs and Higgins boats and men wading chest-deep in cold water under fire. "If the roads collapse," Leland said quietly, "we lose the trucks. If we lose the trucks, the supplies don't reach the front. If the supplies don't reach the front, then Rommel wins the battle we haven't fought yet." Aldridge lit another cigarette. "I know, you know, everyone knows, but the decision's been made, and we're the ones who have to make it work." Leland looked at him. "You were in North Africa, Tobruk, then Alamein, then Sicily." Aldridge exhaled smoke into the rain. "I've seen what happens when the logistics chain breaks. I've seen men die because the fuel trucks didn't arrive, or the ammunition convoy took a wrong turn, or the field hospital ran out of morphine. I've seen tank crews abandon perfectly good Shermans because there was no petrol to run them, and I've seen staff officers in clean uniforms make decisions that look brilliant on a map and turn into blood and wreckage on the ground." Leland said nothing. There was nothing to say. The manifests were signed. The trucks were loaded. The convoys were scheduled. The plan, such as it was, had already left the realm of theory and entered the realm of inevitability. "I'll need your drivers briefed on the revised weight limits," Aldridge said. "They need to know the trucks will handle differently. Longer braking distance, higher center of gravity. If they take a corner too fast on a muddy road, they'll roll. I'll brief them. Are you enjoying the content? Click the like button and subscribe to the channel, and I'll need confirmation from your maintenance crews that every axle's been inspected. We can't afford breakdowns on the beachhead. If a truck goes down in the surf zone, it becomes an obstacle. Obstacles slow the unloading. Slowing the unloading kills the timetable. I'll get you the confirmations." Aldridge nodded. He was about to say something else when a sergeant appeared in the warehouse doorway, rain dripping from his helmet, a dispatch case under his arm. "Sir," the sergeant said, looking at Leland. "Signal from Chef. Weather update. Storm front moving in from the Atlantic. Channel Seas building. Admiral Ramsey's requesting a conference call with all convoy commanders at 0600. Leland felt something cold settle in his chest. The weather had been the great unknown, the variable that no amount of planning could control. Eisenhower had already postponed the invasion once, from June 5th to June 6th, gambling that a brief window of clearer weather would open between two storm systems. If that window closed, if the seas became too rough for the landing craft, if the winds scattered the airborne drops, if the cloud cover prevented naval gunfire spotters from seeing their targets, then the entire operation would have to be delayed again. And delay at this stage meant risking German discovery of the embarkation points, risking the collapse of operational security, risking the loss of surprise that was the invasion's only real advantage. "Thank you, Sergeant," Leland said. The sergeant saluted and disappeared back into the rain. Aldridge looked at Leland. "If they scrub it, they won't scrub it. They can't. Too many men already embarked. Too many ships already at sea. Then we go, storm or no storm." Leland nodded slowly. He thought about the 243 overloaded trucks behind him, each one a small wager against physics and fate. He thought about the men who would drive those trucks across the channel in flat-bottomed landing ships, who would unload them under artillery fire, who would navigate cratered roads and flooded fields and German ambushes to deliver their cargo to units they would never meet. He thought about the bridges that would need to be built, the fuel that would need to flow, the ammunition that would need to arrive exactly when and where it was needed, every single day for weeks, until the beachhead became a bridgehead, and the bridgehead became a front, and the front became the long, grinding march toward Germany. And he thought about the weight of all that planning, all that hope, resting on the shoulders of men like the sergeant who had just brought the weather report, men whose names would never appear in the history books, whose decisions would be forgotten as soon as they were made, whose exhaustion and fear and determination were the invisible foundation of everything that was about to happen. "We go," Leland said, "and we make it work." The conference call at 0600 was held in a requisitioned hotel on the waterfront, in a room that still smelled faintly of tobacco and old carpet, despite having been stripped of furniture and converted into a signal center. Leland sat at a long table with a dozen other logistics officers, American and British, while a naval commander stood at the front and pointed to a weather map pinned to the wall. The map showed the English Channel as a narrow grey strait between two landmasses, overlaid with concentric circles and arrows indicating wind speed and direction. A thick black line marked the projected path of the storm front. "Seas are running at 6 to 8 feet in the channel," the commander said. "Winds gusting to 30 knots. Forecast calls for partial clearing on the morning of the 6th, with a window of 12 to 18 hours before the next system moves in." He tapped the map. "Admiral Ramsay and General Eisenhower have decided to proceed. Pack hour remains 0630, June 6th. First wave crosses tonight. Second wave departs Portsmouth and Southampton tomorrow evening. Are you enjoying the content? Click the like button and subscribe to the channel." There were no questions. No one in the room was there to debate the decision. They were there to execute it. Afterward, Leland walked back to Warehouse 14, through a grey dawn that smelled of rain and seaweed. The harbour was coming alive. Cranes swinging cargo nets over the decks of landing ships, trucks moving in slow convoys toward the embarkation points, soldiers in rain-soaked uniforms standing in long lines with rifles slung and packs heavy. The noise was constant. Diesel engines shouted orders, the clang of metal on metal, the low rumble of distant thunder or naval gunfire, or both. Leland couldn't tell anymore. It all blended together into a kind of mechanical roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He found Aldridge in the warehouse, overseeing the final loading of a convoy of Bedford QL trucks, British 3-tonners painted in mottled camouflage. Aldridge was arguing with a corporal about the placement of a stack of bridging timbers, his voice calm but unyielding. "They go on top of the fuel cans, Corporal, not underneath. If we take fire and those timbers shift, they'll puncture the cans. Punctured cans mean a fire. A fire means we lose the truck and everything in it." "Yes, sir." Aldridge saw Leland and walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "We're going, then. We're going." "Good." Aldridge folded the rag and stuffed it into his pocket. "I've been coordinating with the Royal Engineers. They'll have Bailey Bridge sections preloaded on tank landing ships, ready to deploy as soon as we secure the inland routes. The plan is to establish a temporary bridge across the Douve River by the 9th, assuming the Germans haven't blown all the existing crossings. Without that bridge, we can't move supplies west to support the American advance on Cherbourg." "Cherbourg," Leland said. The name carried weight. Cherbourg was the only deep-water port within reach of the invasion force, the only place capable of handling the volume of supplies that the Allied armies would need once they broke out of the beachhead. Until Cherbourg was captured and its harbour facilities repaired, everything, every tank, every shell, every bandage, would have to come ashore over the beaches or through the Mulberry Harbors. It was a logistical bottleneck so severe that the entire campaign could founder on it. "We take Cherbourg by the 20th, Aldridge said, "or we risk running out of fuel before we reach the Seine. And if we run out of fuel, the Germans counterattack and we're back in the Channel." Leland nodded. He had seen the supply projections, the graphs that plotted tonnage against time, the estimates of how many tons of ammunition and fuel and rations would be consumed per division per day. The numbers were staggering. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Everything depended on a chain of assumptions, that the Mulberry Harbors would be operational by the 10th, that the roads would hold, that the trucks would keep running, that the Germans would retreat faster than they could destroy the infrastructure, that the weather would cooperate, that nothing unforeseen would go catastrophically wrong. "We need to talk about what happens if the mulberries don't work," Leland said. Aldridge looked at him. "If the mulberries don't work, we're unloading everything through DUKWs and landing craft for the next 3 months, which means we'll be lucky to sustain 3 divisions in combat, which means Rommel bleeds us dry and we lose Normandy. So the mulberries have to work." "The mulberries have to work," Aldridge agreed. He pulled out another cigarette but didn't light it, just turned it over in his fingers. "The problem is that we're assembling the largest artificial harbors ever built in the middle of a war zone, in open water, under German artillery observation. Mulberry A alone is 350,000 tons of steel and concrete. It's being towed across the channel in sections by tugs and positioned by engineers who've never done anything like this before. If a storm hits before it's anchored, the whole thing could break apart and sink. Has anyone told Eisenhower that? Eisenhower knows. He signed off on the plan anyway, because the alternative is worse." Leland understood. The alternative was defeat. The convoys began crossing the channel on the night of June 5th. Leland stood on the dock and watched the first wave depart, a long line of landing ships moving out into the dark, their wakes phosphorescent in the black water. The sky was low and heavy, the wind gusting hard enough to rattle the rigging on the moored vessels. Rain fell in cold sheets, soaking through his uniform and running down inside his collar. He could see soldiers on the decks of the ships, hunched against the weather, their faces pale and anonymous in the dim light. Some of them would be dead by morning. All of them knew it. By dawn on June 6th, the beachhead reports were coming in over the radio. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. German resistance was heavier than expected. The pre-invasion bombardment had missed most of the fortifications. Landing craft were burning in the surf. Tanks were drowning. Men were pinned down below the seawall. The follow-on waves were stacking up offshore, unable to land because the beaches were clogged with wreckage and bodies. At Gold and Juno, the British and Canadian forces were making progress, but slowly, fighting through minefields and concrete bunkers. Sword Beach was contested. Utah Beach was secure but isolated, and through all of it, the supplies kept coming. DUKWs churned through the surf, 6-wheeled amphibious trucks loaded with ammunition and fuel, their drivers steering blind through smoke and spray. Higgins boats ferried crates of rations and medical supplies, grounding on the sand and dropping their ramps while men waded ashore under machine gun fire. Engineers worked in the shallows, clearing obstacles, marking lanes, dragging disabled vehicles out of the way. Officers shouted coordinates into radios. Wounded men lay in rows above the tide line, waiting for evacuation. The noise was inhuman. Explosions, gunfire, engines, screams, the roar of naval bombardment pounding German positions inland. Leland crossed on the evening of June 7th with the second wave, riding in a landing ship tank crammed with GMC trucks and exhausted drivers. The channel was rough, the ship pitching and yawing, green water breaking over the bow. Men vomited into buckets. The smell of diesel fuel and sweat and vomit filled the hold. Leland sat on a crate of ammunition and listened to the engines and tried not to think about what would happen if a mine or a torpedo hit them before they reached the beach. They grounded at Gold Beach just after midnight. The ramp dropped, and Leland drove the first truck down into knee-deep water, the engine roaring, the wheels spinning in the sand. The beach was lit by fires and flares, a surreal landscape of wrecked landing craft and abandoned equipment and shell craters filling with seawater. Tracer rounds arced overhead. Somewhere inland, artillery was firing, the muzzle flashes lighting the horizon in brief, white pulses. Leland followed a taped lane up the beach to a supply dump that had been established behind a low ridge, where men were unloading trucks by hand and stacking crates under camouflage netting. Are you enjoying the content? Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. A British major he didn't recognize directed him to a parking area and told him to report to the beach control officer for further orders. Leland found the officer, a harried American colonel with a radio operator shadowing him, and received his assignment. Drive inland to a field depot being established near the village of Crowley. Unload, return to the beach for another load. Repeat until the trucks broke down or the fuel ran out or the Germans counterattacked. What about the Mulberry? Leland asked. The colonel shook his head. Mulberry A is still being positioned off Omaha. Mulberry B is scheduled to open here at Gold by the 10th. Until then, everything comes ashore the hard way. Leland drove inland on a narrow road clogged with traffic. British infantry moving forward, ambulances moving back, motorcycle couriers weaving between vehicles. The road was pocked with craters, some of them hastily filled with rubble, others bypassed entirely. German snipers were still operating in the hedgerows, and twice Leland heard the crack of rifle fire close enough to make him flinch. But the convoys kept moving, because stopping meant congestion, and congestion meant targets, and targets meant casualties. The field depot at Crowley was a muddy clearing surrounded by stone walls and trees, lit by electric lamps strung between posts. Engineers were building a corduroy road out of logs to prevent the trucks from sinking. Ammunition was piled in stacks covered with tarps. Fuel was stored in jerrycans arranged in rows, each row marked with white paint. Medical supplies were sorted into wooden crates labeled in stenciled black letters. And everywhere, men were working, hauling, lifting, digging, unloading, their faces blank with exhaustion. Leland found Aldridge there, coordinating with the Royal Engineers captain about the placement of a Bailey bridge across a small stream that fed into the Sules River. The captain was explaining that the stream was deeper than it looked on the maps, that the soil was too soft to support the bridge's anchor points, that they would need to drive pilings and pour concrete footings, which would take another 2 days. "We don't have 2 days," Aldridge said. "The forward depots need resupply by the 9th. If we can't cross this stream, we have to detour 10 miles south, and that puts the convoys within range of German artillery." "Then we'll do it in 1 day," the captain said. "But I'll need every man you can spare." Aldridge saw Leland and walked over. His uniform was caked with mud, his face drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. "Mulberry B?" Leland asked. "Delayed. Storm damage during the tow. They're repairing the breakwater sections now. Should be operational by the 12th if the weather holds." "And if it doesn't?" Aldridge looked at him. "Then we pray." The storm came on June 19th. Leland was at the field depot near Crowley when the wind picked up, gusting hard enough to tear the camouflage netting off the supply stacks. The sky turned dark, the rain coming down in grey curtains that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards. The radio reported that a full gale was moving across the channel, winds exceeding 40 knots, seas running at 12 to 15 feet. All landing operations were suspended. Ships offshore were ordered to seek shelter or ride out the storm at anchor. The Mulberry Harbors, barely 2 weeks old, were taking a direct hit. By the morning of June 20th, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was destroyed. The breakwaters had shifted, the pontoon piers had broken loose, the floating roadways had collapsed into the surf. Millions of pounds of steel and concrete, months of planning, weeks of construction, gone in a single night. Mulberry B at Arromanches held, but barely, its outer sections battered and breached, its unloading capacity reduced by half. Leland stood in the rain and watched the repair crews working in the harbour, welders and divers and crane operators labouring in the wind and spray to salvage what they could. Aldridge was there too, shouting orders over the noise of the storm, coordinating with British naval officers who were trying to reposition the damaged sections before they sank or drifted into the beach. The mood was grim. Mulberry A was gone. Mulberry B was crippled. The entire logistical plan for the Normandy campaign had just been cut in half. "We shift everything to Mulberry B," Aldridge said, his voice hoarse. "Double the unloading crews. Extend the working hours. Prioritize fuel and ammunition. Everything else comes ashore through the DUKWs. We don't have enough DUKWs. Then we make do with what we have." Leland looked at him. "We're 3 weeks into the campaign and we're already rationing supplies. If we don't take Cherbourg in the next 10 days, we'll take Cherbourg," Aldridge said. "We have to," but the question hung in the air between them, unspoken and unanswerable. What if we don't? Part 2. Cherbourg fell on June 26th, but the victory was hollow. German engineers had done their work with methodical precision, demolishing the harbour facilities, sinking block ships in the channels, mining the quays, and destroying every crane, every warehouse, every piece of unloading equipment that could have been useful. When American troops entered the port, they found a graveyard of twisted steel and rubble. Navy salvage crews estimated it would take weeks, perhaps months, to clear the harbour and make it operational. Meanwhile, the Allied advance was consuming ammunition and fuel at rates that exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. Leland received the orders on June 28th, delivered by a motorcycle courier who pulled up to the supply depot outside Carrington with mud splattered across his goggles. The message was brief: establish a high-priority truck convoy route from the Normandy beaches directly to forward supply dumps supporting the American advance. Priority cargo, fuel and ammunition. Route designation, Red Ball Express. Operational start date, June 30th. Are you enjoying the content? Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. He found Aldridge 2 hours later at a temporary headquarters, set up in a commandeered farmhouse 5 miles inland. The house had been hit by artillery. One wall collapsed, the roof open to the sky. British and American officers worked at folding tables, arranged in what had once been a kitchen, surrounded by maps and radio equipment and dispatch cases. Aldridge was arguing with a lieutenant colonel about truck maintenance schedules, his voice tired but insistent. "We're running the vehicles 18 hours a day," Aldridge was saying. "The drivers are sleeping in shifts, the engines are overheating, the tires are shredding on these roads. If we don't rotate the trucks into maintenance every 72 hours, we'll lose half the fleet to mechanical failure before we reach the Seine." The lieutenant colonel shook his head. "We don't have 72 hours. Patton's armour is moving out from Avranches on July 1st. If his tanks run out of fuel, the breakout stalls. If the breakout stalls, the Germans counterattack. We need every truck on the road." Aldridge saw Leland and excused himself. They walked outside into the late afternoon sun, the first clear weather in days. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. In the distance, artillery rumbled, a constant background thunder that never quite stopped. "They're launching the Red Ball," Leland said. "I know. I helped write the operational plan." Aldridge pulled out a cigarette, then seemed to think better of it and put it away. "It's the only way to keep the advance supplied until Cherbourg comes online. We'll run dedicated convoys, one-way traffic around the clock, American drivers on American trucks, supported by British fuel depots and maintenance companies. It's ambitious, it's probably insane, but it might work. How many trucks? 6,000 eventually. We'll start with 2,000 and scale up as we can. The route runs from Saint-Lô north to Bayeux, then inland following the advance. No civilian traffic, no stops except for fuel and emergencies. The goal is to move 5,000 tons of supplies per day." Leland did the math in his head. 5,000 tons per day, divided by the cargo capacity of a GMC truck, multiplied by the round-trip distance, factored for breakdowns and delays. The numbers were staggering. "We'll burn through tires and spare parts faster than we can replace them." "I know. We'll lose drivers to exhaustion, accidents, ambushes." "I know. And if it doesn't work, then the advance stops," Aldridge said quietly. "And we spend the next 6 months bogged down in Normandy while the Germans rebuild their defenses and the Russians take Berlin alone." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a convoy of Bedford trucks roll past on the road below, their canvas sides flapping in the wind. The drivers looked young, barely old enough to shave, their faces grey with dust and fatigue. Leland thought about the weight those men carried. Not just the cargo in their trucks, but the invisible burden of knowing that their work, their endurance, their ability to stay awake through one more night shift, one more 100-mile run, one more breakdown on a muddy road, was the difference between victory and failure. "I'll need your best convoy commanders," Aldridge said. "Men who can navigate by map at night, who can handle the trucks when they're overloaded, who won't panic if they take fire. I'll get them. And I'll need coordination with the fuel depots at Isigny and Caen. The trucks can't make the round trip on one tank. They'll need to refuel twice, once at the forward depots and once on the return leg." "What about the pipeline?" Leland asked. "PLUTO." Aldridge shook his head. "PLUTO won't be operational until mid-July at the earliest. The engineers are still laying the underwater sections across the channel. Until then, every drop of fuel comes over the beach in jerrycans or tank trucks." Leland remembered the projections he had seen back in Portsmouth, the calculations of how much fuel Patton's Third Army would consume once it broke out of the bocage and began its race across France. Tens of thousands of gallons per day, perhaps hundreds of thousands. The numbers had seemed abstract then, a problem for some future version of himself to worry about. Now they were real, immediate, unforgiving. "We'll make it work," Leland said, not because he believed it, but because there was nothing else to say. The Red Ball Express began operations on June 30th. Leland stood at the departure point near Omaha Beach and watched the first convoy roll out, 40 GMC trucks in a single column, each one painted with the Red Ball insignia, a red circle on a white background, each one loaded with jerrycans of fuel bound for a forward depot near Coutances. The drivers wore goggles against the dust, their uniforms stained with oil and sweat. A military police jeep led the convoy, red flags flying, horn blaring to clear the road. Behind them, another convoy was already forming, and behind that, another. The system was simple in theory. Trucks departed the beachhead loaded with supplies, drove inland on dedicated routes marked with red ball signs, unloaded at forward depots, and returned empty for another load. No stops except for fuel and emergencies. No delays. The convoys ran day and night, headlights taped to narrow slits, drivers navigating by moonlight and memory, and the faint glow of the truck ahead. It was brutal, exhausting work, and within the first week the casualty reports began to filter back. Drivers killed in accidents, trucks overturned on narrow roads, convoys ambushed by German stragglers hiding in the hedgerows. Leland drove the route himself on July 3rd, riding in the cab of a lead truck with a sergeant named Kowalski who'd been hauling supplies since Omaha Beach. Kowalski was 23 years old, from Pittsburgh, with dark circles under his eyes and hands that never quite stopped shaking. He drove with a mechanical precision that spoke of too many hours behind the wheel, too many nights without sleep, too much adrenaline and too little rest. "You get used to it," Kowalski said, his voice flat. "The noise, the dust, the way the truck handles when it's overloaded. You stop thinking about it. You just drive." They passed through Saint-Lô, or what was left of it, a moonscape of rubble and craters. Buildings collapsed into the streets, civilians wandering through the ruins with blank faces. The roads were clogged with military traffic, ambulances and tanks and supply trucks and infantry columns, all moving in the same direction, all part of the same grinding machinery of war. The air smelled of cordite and rot. North of Coutances, they stopped at a fuel depot to refill the truck's tank. The depot was a clearing in a forest, surrounded by camouflage netting, guarded by soldiers with M1 Garands. Jerrycans were stacked in pyramids, hundreds of them, each one stamped with U.S. Army markings. A corporal checked Kowalski's manifest and directed him to a pumping station, where two privates hand-cranked fuel from a storage tank into the truck's main tank. The process took 20 minutes. Kowalski smoked a cigarette and stared at nothing. "How many runs have you made?" Leland asked. Lost count after 30. Kowalski flicked ash onto the ground. We're supposed to get rotated out after 100 hours, but there aren't enough drivers, so we keep going. You holding up? Kowalski laughed, a short, bitter sound. I fell asleep at the wheel 2 nights ago. Woke up when the truck hit a ditch. Nobody hurt. Truck still drivable. But I can't remember falling asleep. 1 second I'm driving, the next second I'm in the ditch. That scare you, Captain? Yes. Scares me too. They reached the forward depot at dusk, a sprawling camp of tents and supply stacks, protected by a perimeter of sandbags and barbed wire. Sherman tanks were parked in rows, crews working on them by lamplight, replacing tracks, cleaning guns, filling fuel tanks from the jerrycans Kowalski had delivered. A logistics lieutenant directed the unloading, soldiers forming a human chain to pass the jerrycans from the truck to a storage area. The work was efficient, practiced, silent. Within 15 minutes, the truck was empty. Kowalski turned it around and headed back toward the coast. On the return trip, they passed another convoy heading forward, 30 trucks running without lights in the growing dark. Leland could see the drivers' faces through the windshields, pale and spectral, eyes fixed on the road. One of the trucks had a flat tire, the rubber shredded and flapping against the rim. But the driver kept going, the truck listing to one side, sparks flying from the bare wheel. There was no time to stop. By mid-July, the Red Ball Express was moving 6,000 tons of supplies per day, but the cost was mounting. Trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Drivers were collapsing from exhaustion. Accidents were claiming more lives than enemy action. And still the demand increased, driven by the relentless pace of the Allied advance. Patton's Third Army had broken out of Normandy and was racing east, consuming fuel and ammunition at rates that terrified the logistics planners. Every mile Patton advanced required another convoy, another shipment, another load of jerrycans hauled from the beachhead to the front. Leland was at the depot near Bayeux when the report came in about PLUTO. The pipeline was operational. Engineers had successfully laid the underwater sections across the channel and connected them to pumping stations on the French coast. Fuel was flowing directly from England to Normandy, bypassing the need for tank ships and jerrycans. It was a triumph of engineering, an invisible artery that would sustain the Allied advance all the way to Germany. Aldridge was there when Leland received the news, standing beside a map table covered with route overlays and supply projections. He looked thinner than he had in Portsmouth, his uniform hanging loose, his scar more prominent against his pale skin, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Pluto's operational," Leland said. "We're pumping 1 million gallons a day by the end of the week. Are you enjoying the content?" "Click the like button and subscribe to the channel," Aldridge nodded slowly. "It won't be enough. Patton's burning through 3 million gallons a week. The British Second Army needs another 2 million. We'll still need the Red Ball, and we'll need to expand it. The trucks won't last. They don't have to last. They just have to keep running until we take Paris. After that, we can use the French rail system." Leland looked at the map, at the red lines marking the Allied advance, at the blue circles indicating supply depots, at the black crosses marking German positions. The map was a web of logistics, a diagram of everything that had to go right for the campaign to succeed. And beneath the lines and symbols were the invisible thousands, the drivers, the mechanics, the engineers, the clerks, the men who moved the supplies and built the bridges and cleared the roads and kept the machinery of war running. "We're going to win," Leland said. It was not a question. "Yes," Aldridge said, "but we're going to pay for it." And on July 25th, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout from the Normandy beachhead supported by carpet bombing and concentrated armor. The German line collapsed. Patton's tanks poured through the gap and raced south, then east, then north in a sweeping envelopment that threatened to trap entire German armies. The Red Ball Express ran day and night, every truck on the road, every driver pushed to the limit. Supply depots sprang up and vanished as the front moved faster than the maps could be updated. And through it all, the fuel flowed, the ammunition moved, the machinery of logistics bent but did not break. Leland drove the route one last time in late July, accompanying a convoy of replacement trucks bound for a depot near Le Mans. The countryside had changed. The hedgerows and ruined villages of Normandy gave way to open fields and intact towns, French civilians waving from the roadside, children running beside the trucks. The war was moving east, leaving behind the shattered landscape of the invasion. At the depot, he found Aldridge coordinating with a French resistance liaison about the condition of the roads ahead. The Frenchman was explaining that the Germans had demolished several bridges, that the detours would add hours to the convoy routes, that local civilians were willing to help with repairs but needed tools and materials. Aldridge was listening, making notes on a map, asking questions in passable French. He looked up when Leland approached, and for a moment, something like relief crossed his face. "We've done it," Aldridge said quietly. "Normandy's secure. The ports are open. The supply lines are holding. We've actually done it." Leland nodded. He thought about the months of planning, the sleepless nights in Portsmouth, the storm that had destroyed Mulberry A, the race to Cherbourg, the endless convoys grinding through the dark. He thought about the men who hadn't made it, the drivers killed in accidents, the engineers killed by artillery, the sailors drowned when landing craft capsized in the surf. He thought about the weight of command, the burden of making decisions that turned lives into numbers, men into resources, exhaustion into a tactical variable. "We've done it," Leland repeated, but the words felt hollow, insufficient. August brought new challenges. The advance was outrunning the supply lines. Patton was screaming for fuel. Montgomery was demanding priority for the British Second Army, and the Red Ball Express was stretched to the breaking point. Trucks that had been rated for 50,000 miles were failing at 30,000. Drivers who had been on the road since June were being evacuated for nervous exhaustion. The system was cracking, held together by improvisation and willpower, and the refusal to admit that it couldn't be done. Leland spent most of August in motion, traveling between depots, troubleshooting breakdowns, coordinating with British supply officers, and writing reports that no one had time to read. He slept in jeeps and in the cabs of trucks and on the floors of requisitioned buildings. He stopped shaving. He stopped noticing the weight he was losing. He stopped counting the days. On August 20th, he was at a depot near Chartres when a major from Chafe arrived with new orders. Paris was about to be liberated. The Allies needed to establish supply lines into the city immediately to feed the population, to support the French resistance, to demonstrate that liberation meant more than just driving out the Germans. Leland was being reassigned to coordinate the logistics of the Paris operation. He read the orders twice, then set them down on the table. Paris, the city that had been the objective of the entire campaign, the symbol of occupied Europe, the prize that had driven the planning and the sacrifices and the impossible logistics. And now it was about to be liberated, and someone needed to make sure the people there didn't starve while the armies moved on toward Germany. "Do you need anything, sir?" the major asked. Leland looked at him. The major was young, maybe 25, with clean hands and a pressed uniform. He had probably been in France for less than a week. "No," Leland said, "I don't need anything." September came, and with it the realization that the war would not end in 1944. The Germans were retreating, but they were not defeated. The Allied supply lines had stretched to the breaking point and beyond. The Red Ball Express continued to run, but it was no longer enough. Rationing was imposed on fuel and ammunition. Offensives were postponed. The great momentum of the summer advance began to slow, then stall. Leland was in Paris on September 8th, coordinating the delivery of flour and medical supplies to civilian distribution centers. The city was jubilant, crowds filling the streets, flags flying from every building. But beneath the celebration was the reality of occupation. 4 years of hunger and fear and loss. The supply convoys were greeted like saviors, but Leland knew they were only a stopgap, a temporary relief before the next crisis. He was standing on the Pont Neuf, watching a convoy of Bedford trucks cross the Seine, when he saw Aldridge. The British major was leaning against the stone railing, smoking a cigarette, watching the same convoy. He looked older, his scar more pronounced, his eyes distant. "I thought you were in Brussels," Leland said. "I was. They sent me back to coordinate with the French Logistics Corps." Aldridge took a drag on the cigarette. "We're trying to rebuild the rail system. It'll take months." "How much longer? Until the war ends?" Aldridge shrugged. "Spring, maybe. If we can keep the supplies moving through the winter, if the Germans don't counterattack, if we don't run out of fuel or ammunition or trucks or men." Leland looked at the river, at the light reflecting off the water, at the city spread out around them. He thought about Portsmouth, about the night before D-Day, about the weight of the manifests and the overloaded trucks and the decisions that had seemed so impossible then. They had made those decisions. They had crossed the channel. They had built the supply lines. They had done what the plan said was barely possible, and they had done it through exhaustion and improvisation and the refusal to fail. But the cost was written in the faces of the men who had driven the trucks, who had built the bridges, who had unloaded the ships under fire. It was written in the wrecked vehicles left beside the roads, in the makeshift graves marked with helmets and rifles, in the silent understanding that logistics was not a bloodless science, but a form of combat fought with tonnage and time and human endurance. "We did what we came to do," Aldridge said quietly. "Yes," Leland said, "we did." They stood in silence, watching the convoy disappear into the city, watching the river flow beneath the bridge, watching the sun set over Paris. And in that moment, there was nothing more to say. The war would go on. The supplies would keep moving. The convoys would keep running, and they would keep doing what they had always done, making the impossible work, one truck at a time, until the job was done. Dawn came slowly to the depot at Chartres on the morning of September 15th. Leland stood beside a Bailey bridge that Royal Engineers had erected across a tributary of the Eure River 3 weeks earlier. The bridge was scarred with use, its steel beams streaked with rust and mud, its wooden decking splintered from the passage of thousands of trucks. Below, the water ran clear and cold, reflecting the pale sky. The last convoy of the night was crossing now, a dozen GMC trucks returning empty from the forward depots, their drivers slumped over the wheels, too tired to wave. Leland watched them pass and thought about all the convoys that had come before, the ones that had made it through and the ones that hadn't. He thought about Kowalski, who had been killed 2 weeks earlier when his truck overturned on a muddy road near Reims. He thought about the British corporal who had died repairing a fuel pump under German artillery fire. He thought about the faceless thousands who had built the roads and the bridges and the depots, who had worked until their hands bled and their bodies broke, who had done their jobs without recognition or reward because the job was all that mattered. A young lieutenant approached, holding a clipboard. "Sir, the morning manifest is ready for your review." Leland took the clipboard and scanned the numbers. 300 trucks scheduled to depart for the front, 22,000 gallons of fuel, 40 tons of ammunition, 12 tons of rations, the machinery of war reduced to columns of figures. "Approve it," Leland said, handing back the clipboard. The lieutenant saluted and walked away. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the depot. In the distance, artillery rumbled, faint and constant. The war went on. Leland reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a letter he had started writing 3 days earlier, addressed to his wife in Virginia. The paper was creased and stained, the ink smudged from being carried in his pocket. He had written 4 sentences, then stopped, unable to find the words to explain what he had seen, what he had done, what it had cost. He folded the letter and put it away. Someday, perhaps, he would find the words. But not today. Today there were convoys to run, supplies to move, bridges to cross. Today the work continued. He turned and walked back toward the depot, his limp more pronounced in the morning cold, his shadow stretching long behind him. Above, the sky was clearing, the bridge held, the trucks kept moving, and somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, the war waited.